Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Heiber, and I'm excited to be presenting to you today about the work that we've been doing, spearheaded by our CEO, Eric Jones, together with our collaborator at UT Austin, Professor Roger Bonikes. I'm really excited to be talking to you about this and excited to have a chance to work on this project at Enthought because I really think it's going to have a big impact on materials R&D. And one thing a little different from many of the other talks at SciPy is that in addition to software, we're also going to be talking quite a bit here about hardware. And I hope you guys will find this to be interesting and stimulating of some discussion and thought. So just a little bit more about me. I'm a PhD polymer scientist from the University of Akron. And following my graduate work, I had an extended postdoctoral academic research career where I was designing and using custom physics-based simulations, automated characterization hardware, and automated data analysis tools for accelerating the development of polymer optoelectronic materials and devices. And so when I came to Enthought about a year ago, I was really excited at the opportunity to work on very similar themes for our industrial partners. For those of you unfamiliar with Enthought, we're a small but rapidly growing company headquartered in Austin, Texas, where we would be holding SciPy under normal circumstances. But yeah, we were founded in 2001, and shortly after there in 2002, we founded the SciPy conference. And so for many years now, we've been the institutional sponsor of the SciPy conference, and we're very connected with the open source scientific Python community. But over the years, our company has grown, so we now have offices scattered around the globe. And our focus is a little bit broader than just scientific Python, but it's really on digital transformation for science companies. So with that in mind, we've worked with a lot of different industry partners over the years, and we've built a lot of tools in Python. We've been big contributors, again, to the open source scientific Python community. And on top of that, we've also built a lot of our own internal tools for rapid application development, so we can quickly build powerful scientific desktop applications to do a wide variety of things. In the material science space, we've done a lot of different solutions around various types of data analysis, physics-based simulations, and more recently, we've actually started getting involved now with hardware as well, where we're not just looking at data analysis, but starting to think more about where is data coming from and how can we accelerate and transform the experiments that are being done in the laboratory. So one example, many of our clients work in what we call the specialty chemical industry, and so their product development process oftentimes looks a lot like this, where they'll get a customer request that comes in. Then they need to go through a series of iterations where they're tweaking their formulation. That could be synthesizing new polymers. That could be playing with new additives. They then send materials out for evaluation from their customer. And then if it's approved, they go through with the scale up, and then the final sale is completed after about a year's time. This is fairly slow, and so we ask, well, could we do this significantly faster? And what kind of value would this have for your business? And so they may start out and say, well, what if we could design a material in half the time, where now it only takes us, about 5 or 6 months to do this whole process. It's obviously better. You're going to start being able to be faster than your competitors, and you may start to win new business value from this. But it's not exactly a transformative change to materials development. The client makes a request, and they're still waiting months and months and months for you to come back with a candidate material. And during that waiting time, they can't make changes to their design based on the material you give them. They're just waiting. And so the question would be, well, what happens if you can really push this limit even further? What if you could deliver a candidate material, in days or weeks? What might this do to your business and to your customer's business? Really, it enables a very different business model in how you work between the materials supplier and the materials purchaser. And this is the kind of thing we want to think about. How can we enable companies to move this rapidly so that new materials can be integrated into innovative new products faster and faster and have a major impact on the quality of everyone's lives? So how are we going to do this? Well, one thing you can do, it's kind of fun, you can Google Lab of the Future, and you get a picture. This is one of the first things that popped up in my search. You get here a scientist here working at a giant touchscreen display where he's kind of manipulating the data with his hands. He's got all sorts of different things up there that he can interact with to use that to make decisions about what to do next. There's a great quote here from this article. The lab of the future is a place where scientists, engineers, or frankly, researchers of any discipline can step around the mundane aspects associated with having a lab. That is planning, performing maintenance, scheduling, and preparing, and get straight to the process of experimentation. The reality, though, is that laboratories work in a very slow, heavily human-centric method. You can see here an example of what a typical workflow might look like in an industrial chemical laboratory, where you have scientists sitting at various stations where initially they're measuring out reagents using a balance, a pipette, and writing down in their physical laboratory notebooks what they've done, and then moving on and doing their polymerization step, at a bench chemistry setup, where they're writing down their notes in a laboratory notebook. Once that polymerization is complete, they're going to take their product to a series of characterizations where now they're lucky if they're able to plug in a USB stick to get their data off the machine. But again, every step along this workflow is manual. Each station is designed for a person to sit there to do some task, to then take their material and their data from one station to the next. This continues on to formulation, and then in this example, in the electronics industry, into the clean room where they're going to be creating a thin film, doing various types of characterization of that film. Now, one example of how you might consider improving on this process would be, can we replace the human with a robot? And so you could imagine having a robot-centric R&D process where the individual steps and all the equipment that's used doesn't change at all. You simply have a very sophisticated robot that's able to do all the steps. An alternative way to think about this would be, let's think about redesigning all the steps. Can we imagine a future where there's a digital-centric R&D workflow, including a variety of different miniaturized instrument modules that are designed to communicate over a standard Wi-Fi or Ethernet connection, are able to send data and receive messages, and are connected by some kind of system that easily moves sample and chemical from one station to the next? This general concept of a modular form of lab automation is not completely new. I found this nice article in Medium from a company called Zymergen, and they're working on their own laboratory automation setup for their product development. And what they said in this article was that no one would sell us a high throughput system that could be reconfigured in minutes and would also scale to fill the factory. So they built one. So this is part of their intellectual property now, their system for a modular automation and how they're using that to accelerate the development of their biomaterials. As far as I know, these modules are not for sale. They look to be also fairly large and likely to be pretty expensive, I would guess. So we're envisioning something a little bit different than this, but the modularity piece is very similar. So what we're imagining is, in this funnel here of candidate material screening, you could imagine an initial case of the screening process where you might be screening candidate materials using a computational methods, and there's a variety of different ones you could potentially use. But the idea is that these methods would be low cost, high throughput, but potentially giving up on the accuracy and the lower fidelity, lower accuracy of that method. But they can be done to just give you a preliminary screening ability. So we're imagining a really great place for automation to come in is the next step below that, where can we develop automated laboratory systems which are medium cost, still high throughput, and they have better fidelity than probably most computational methods will have because they're actually performing experiments. But they don't need to necessarily be the most top-of-the-line advanced experiments that are done, which are maybe very more expensive or difficult to automate. That would be used then to funnel down the candidates into the next stage where you may actually have humans doing the research. They may do mostly the full workflow to verify that the candidate materials meet the customer specifications, but with the understanding that you don't need to do such a detailed investigation of every single candidate material that you think of, especially early on in the design process. And only then after that step would you pass this candidate material on for customer validation like you do in the current system. So what's it going to take to build this candidate material screening funnel that we've identified here? Well, we think there's a few things that we really need to make this happen. First, as we identified before, modularity is really important for being able to mix and match different instruments as needed to build up complex workflows for both fabricating and characterizing material samples. But in general, these modules that are designed need to have very low costs, much lower than typical cost for equipment that you'll see in most laboratories today. Completely replacing a laboratory can cost, millions of dollars, and doing that is a very big financial risk. In addition, there's also sort of physical risks. And so we need to demonstrate that these things are possible. We also need to demonstrate the value in automation. A lot of people just don't think that it's valuable enough for them to try automation to begin with. And so what we really need to do is be working together as a community to build examples of laboratories that demonstrate how low-cost automation can solve real industrial materials problems, orders of magnitude faster than traditional human-centric methodologies. And one potential way to help enable this is through an open innovation ecosystem, much like we see with the open source scientific Python community. And there's already kind of the roots for this growing throughout the community now. There's a lot of examples over the last 5 to 10 years of really cool DIY style laboratory hardware that people are making, much of it coming out of academic laboratories where they're trying to develop low cost laboratory equipment, sort of democratize research. So for example, one of the really nice examples is of a syringe pump, which can cost over $1,000. But you can see that it's fairly easy to print using a 3D printer and buy some components and construct your own DIY syringe pump for around $100. And so you're looking at an order of magnitude decrease in cost. And since these ones have come on, there's been many designs, but it's really an initial example of something really cool. And there's many, many examples, and I'm going to go through a few of them here. You can see a really cool example of a DIY photolithography system where you may start to ask the question, for my industrial research laboratory, do I really need to be spending hundreds of thousands of dollars if I don't need high resolution? Here we have a $400 DIY system that's giving me sub-micron resolution for my photolithography. Of course, you're not going to use this to make state-of-the-art transistors that you see in your integrated circuit, but for display applications, for example, this is probably more than sufficient. Other examples, you can see just standard optical components that you'd use to build any kind of optics setup. You can save, 97% of cost over standard commercial pieces of equipment by 3D printing your own. Here's another great example. Here's a very simple spectrometer that's been developed by people at Public Lab, where instead of spending $5,000 for a commercial spectrometer, you could build your own for around $100. The capabilities, of course, are going to be less, but maybe that's good enough for your application. There's also an example, maybe you do need something a little bit higher end. There are still designs like that. For example, here in open source Raman Spectroscopy setup that uses pretty much high-end optical components from Thor Labs in this photo. But because the overall configuration and everything has been designed, you're just paying for the components, and you can build your own DIY Raman spectrometer for thousands less than a full commercial equivalent. Here's another example of a motorized optical microscope that can cost many thousands of dollars, and here's a DIY version for only around $250. There's a lot of other microscope designs as well. So these are just some examples of the many really cool open source hardware projects that are going on. And these aren't just hardware, they're also oftentimes, for example, with this microscope, software to control that microscope, to acquire images. And so there's definitely a software component to all of these cases where you have computers controlling the measurement itself and then acquiring the data once the measurement is complete. Within many of these examples, there's a lot of key enablers over the last few years that have really allowed this sort of DIY open source hardware community to start taking off. Some of them, for example, is the Raspberry Pi, which is a great open source single board computer. You have communities for electronics, including Arduino and Adafruit. There's also companies now like Seed Studio who will actually make custom circuit boards and make custom kits. The 3D printer community in general has been amazing in pushing this, allowing you to make custom parts and to really lower the cost barrier for mechatronics. Beyond the hardware itself, there's a lot of communities popping up all over the internet, such as KitSpace for sharing and ordering custom circuit boards, Hackaday.io for collaborative hardware projects. Thingiverse is a great repository for 3D printing designs. And the list goes on here. OpenHardware.io, a great place for sharing your open source hardware designs. You also have associations popping up, for example, the Open Source Hardware Association, to try to develop a community around this. And on the academic side, you also have journals that allow you to now, that are really focused on publishing open hardware so that hardware tool creators can get credit for the really valuable tools that they're creating. So with this in mind, we started a new thing called the 1000X Lab Initiative. And really the broader goal is to transform and dramatically accelerate industrial experimental development of chemicals and materials. And some of the themes that we identified when we were creating this initiative was this idea of appropriate technology, which means, is the piece of hardware that you're using to perform a measurement appropriate to the information that you need? Do you need just a simple quick measurement to give you a ballpark estimate? Or do you need the state-of-the-art detailed measurement? You will want to choose appropriately. The second theme is around miniaturization and modularization of measurements. We already talked about modularization, but miniaturization is also important. We don't need to build instruments that are human-centric and built around human interaction at a workstation. If possible, let's bring the measurements to the material themselves. If the measurements can be miniaturized, maybe we can, instead of moving samples around to different instruments, could we bring instruments to the materials and measure them in situ or immediately before and after certain processes? Can we put together well-established designs for standard processes like fluid handling, powder handling? These are things that everyone has challenges with. There needs to be well-established designs for these things. The last one is data management. In all of these open source hardware initiatives, data management is going to be a key piece. What do we do with all this data we're generating? There needs to be best practices and leading tools that emerge from this community on how to do these things and how to organize data so that it can be used to make R&D decisions. So with that in mind, we gathered a group of leaders from industry, academia, government to Austin in February to have our first Congress to try to start getting opinions about what people think about this idea. What are the challenges that they face in their industry or their field of material science? How can we incorporate all these different thoughts into sort of a plan to go forward? Can we build a community? What needs to be done? What are the needs of this initial community? So here's a picture of me giving a short talk on some of the stuff that we've done in this space, which I'll get to later. We had a variety of great speakers at the event. From industry, we had Will Hart at P&G, who talked about personal care products and rheology and the challenges of measuring these complex products. We had a great talk from Mark Simon at Saint-Gobain talking about building products and the challenges that they face in quality control with products that use natural materials where the feedstocks are changing and their need to be very agile and quick to modify formulations when there are changes in those feedstocks. And we also had a great talk from Peter Soler from Bristol Myers Squibb, giving a very different perspective coming from the pharmaceutical industry where automation is much more common. And he talked a lot about his role using automated laboratory tools to develop their biologics. We then had a series of talks from academic members. We had a talk from Eric First from University of Delaware, who talked about his research on high-throughput microreology. We also had a talk from Philippos Torlamosis from MIT, talking about the open hardware development work done by the Gershenfeld group. We also had a nice talk from Michael McCarthy at UC Davis, talking about miniaturization of MRI rheology. And we also had some representatives from NIST there talking about other related government initiatives and also Martin Green talked about his group's work doing autonomous materials characterization using automated characterization methods. In addition, we also had industry representatives from the semiconductor industry, from the food and beverage industry, and so it was a really good discussion, a lot of different perspectives and challenges from these different industries that were discussed at the event. We also took the opportunity to talk a little bit about our work in the DIY hardware space. In particular, we talked about one project that we have with one of our polymer partners where they are developing thin film materials for display applications. To get them started thinking about transforming their laboratory workflows, we designed an optical microscope that would slot into their existing workflow and accelerate their R&D process. So we had some very particular requirements for this microscope. We wanted to be able to measure features down to several microns so that we'd be able to measure the small features that are present on an OLED display like shown on the right here in this picture. Another challenge was that we needed to be able to measure these features on an opaque silicon wafer substrate. We also wanted to have the ability to have a fairly large travel distance on our automated stage so that we could measure the patterns on different regions on a single, fairly large substrate, and do this all in a way that's faster and more accurate than a human alternative. To integrate with our Python software tools, we also wanted to make sure that this instrument control and image acquisition capabilities with a nice Python API. And so here on the right shows a picture of our first prototype. Some of the main components, we used T-slot aluminum for the frame. We used an Arduino with a CNC shield to control the stepper motors on the motorized X, Y, and Z axes. We also used a Raspberry Pi and Pi camera for controlling the instrument and then also for taking pictures. And then we used a variety of different 3D parts for custom mounting and mating of various pieces. From that initial prototype, we then went on to working also on the software. On the image analysis side, one of the key features we needed to have in this instrument was the ability to have automatic focusing so that as we move the objective around to different parts on the substrate, it would automatically be able to find the focus condition and take an image. So this is an example showing how we developed this using an edge detection algorithm. From there, in only 3 months, we developed a first prototype of this hardware, which was delivered to the client and tested in their laboratory. That really helped us figure out what were the deficiencies with our first design. This is our final microscope that we just finished delivering. And you can see here a number of improvements were made from the last one. Particularly, we went with a faster stepper motor control board, and we really stabilized our Y and Z axis motions to prevent vibrations. And we included a more sophisticated optic setup to give us nice uniform illumination. And you can see here on the bottom, this is an image from a calibration slide. And so you can see we're getting really nice submicron optical resolution here on our microscope. So we can really see these nice lines here. And so we're very happy with the quality of the images that this microscope was able to take in the end. In the end, our team of around 2.5 people designed and built a custom optical microscope with a GUI software control and an image analysis software in 6 months. Our automated optical microscope is estimated to improve the experimental throughput by about 25 times. And this particular microscope costs around $1,300 in parts. And so it's definitely more expensive than the open flexure microscope we saw earlier. But it's definitely very robust, and for this particular purpose, it performs well, and it's up to 50 times less than a high-end conventional microscope that you'd find in a laboratory. Our automated image acquisition and analysis greatly improved measurement consistency and created a higher certainty with our partners during their specialty polymer thin film product development process. Put that all together from our first Congress, again, we had a great discussion, and we tried to pull together some takeaway messages. It seems that everyone has data organization challenges that we need to address as a community. It's pretty clear that the pharmaceutical industry is far ahead of the rest with their laboratory automation efforts. There was identified need for more fast, inexpensive proxy measurements that could be used for early candidate screening. While the DIY hardware is intriguing to many people, there is some apprehension, and industry researchers are feeling concerned about the loss of quality, reliability, and support that you lose when you go to DIY equipment compared to commercial equipment vendors. Industry R&D labs are also concerned that they may not have the budgets or the appetite to take on risky transformative workflows. Because of this, we've identified a strong need for a functional, industry-relevant example to demonstrate the value and lower the perceived risk and show that this actually works. So the next question then is, how can SciPy community get involved? Well, there's a lot of ways. Throughout this process of transforming laboratories, there's a lot of things we need. We need better data organization software tools. We need better open and well-documented instrument control and data acquisition tools. These open hardware projects coming out, some of them have poor APIs and they could benefit from more experienced software engineers that could help them. There's also a lot of opportunities for building software for doing experimental planning and scheduling, and also software for optimization engines for experimental science. So one thing I would just tell all the listeners out there that are maybe active in the open source Python community, try to think about how you can use your open source software experience to help an open source hardware design project so that they can build better overall tools and elevate good projects to become mature and self-sustaining with good documentation, good version control, and a supportive and engaged community. So with that, I thank you for your time. Feel free to email me any questions that you have. I'd be happy to hear from you.